It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. The battle for the Syrian city of Aleppo is over, and the Assad government has taken full control over the city. Civilians are still evacuating, and some rebels still remain in the city. Russia and Turkey have pledged not to let the assassination of Russia's ambassador to Turkey get in the way of the ceasefire. The UN General Assembly is in the process of setting up an investigation into war crimes during the battle for Aleppo. Meanwhile, 300 miles from Aleppo in Iraq, the U.S.-supported effort to retake the city of Mosul from the Islamic State rages on. According to the latest reports, progress there is slower than expected, and Iraqi forces probably won't be able to retake the city for another month or so. Recently, a water pipeline in Mosul was destroyed, and now large parts of the city are cut off from fresh water. Joining us to take a comparative look at the fighting in Aleppo and in Mosul is Sabah Alnasseri. Sabah is an associate professor at York University in Toronto and the editor of Arab Revolutions and Beyond, the Middle East and Reverberations in the Americas. Sabah, so good to have you with us today.
So good to be with you, Sharmini.
Sabah, you have been focusing in terms of your academic work and your interests. There's been a focus on Iraq. So let's begin there. What are some of the main lessons that you think ought to be drawn from the U.S.-backed effort to fight ISIS in Iraq, and what has that fight been like, mainly for the people living there, the Iraqis?
Well, that's a question with three parts. The first one is the lesson drawn. The second one, the fight against ISIS. And the third, the effect on the Iraqi population. To the first part, lesson drawn. The first thing to say is that the United States never really interested in a political solution in Iraq. Quite the opposite. By opting for a military strategy, for a bombing strategy, trying to bomb its way through in Iraq and other parts of the Middle East, made any possible peaceful solution for the conflict in Iraq almost impossible. Just to give you an example, siding with the ex-Minister President al-Maliki Balda'a party, who committed massacre against the peaceful demonstrator in Fallujah, Ramadi in Mosul in December 2013 and January 2014, so that he can win the election in April 2014, open up actually the route for ISIS to enter all these cities and occupy half of Iraq. So the second thing, the United States, instead of pushing for reforms and inclusion of half of the Iraqi population in the western and northwestern provinces of Iraq, they did what they did before, namely creating new militias, turning Iraq into a militia state. And that means escalating the conflict and war further by, again, siding with the Shiite militia or with the al-Maliki government at that time. The third thing is, it was really never about ISIS in Iraq. The United States was not fighting ISIS. Through all these militarization of the conflict in Iraq and making any possible political solution impossible, de facto the United States caused and sustained ISIS in Iraq, and by extension in Syria. After the fact, one can argue this is maybe the best way to secure the so-called national security interests of the United States by sustaining war and making any political solution impossible. The second part of the question about the fighting against ISIS, as I said, it was really never about ISIS, how to fight ISIS. Take, for example, the last battles in this year in Fallujah and Ramadi and Bakoba and so on, until now in Mosul, it was mainly carried by the so-called popular mobilization units. These are Shiite militia, trained and led by Iran. So to a large extent, these Shiite militias actually were engaged in a battle with ISIS in all these cities, and in some cases they were successful, but successful, in a very negative sense, because what you have is destroyed city and displaced population. But still, at the level of the military, territorial level, you can see that they were successful. It was not so much the United States, but actually Iran and their militias who kicked out ISIS fighters from these cities, and now to a large extent also engaged in the fight in Mosul. So the U.S. was not really interested in finishing ISIS. The U.S. wanted only to weaken ISIS, but sustain it in order to have a permanent means of intervention in Iraq and in Syria, etc. The third part of the question, of the effect on the Iraqi population, you see all these fights and conflicts in Iraq and all the different cities, not only left these cities in ruins, but displaced 100,000 of people, and 1,000 people were killed, mutilated, and injured, etc., adding to the million already internally and externally displaced in Iraq and Syria. So you can argue that if the Nazis in 1930 committed the Holocaust of the 20th century against the European Jews, you can say in the 21st century what the United States and the UK and France are committing the first Holocaust in the 21st century. And I can assure you this will not be the last Holocaust. If you add up all the people who are killed and displaced and injured in all Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, etc., this amounts to a third world war. I mean, we are witnessing a third world war with genocidal effect, and maybe a lot of people don't even notice it or are surprised that sometimes up and then there are terror attacks in Europe and the United States. Why on earth is this happening? This is the most surprising thing about the last year or the last few years.
Now, Sabah, if we turn to Syria, certainly the conflict in Syria is different, but there are some important similarities. Right. Just as in Iraq, in Syria, we are dealing with the Islamic State, which is fighting government forces that have a superpower backing them. Right. Except in Syria, the government supporter is Russia instead of the U.S. And based on the experience and your experience of studying Iraq, what can we expect to happen in Syria now that Aleppo has fallen?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. In politics, there are no coincidence. President Obama waived the restriction on arming rebels, foreign fighters, group, individual, Santa Claus, anybody who was fighting in Syria. So they will receive weapons from the United States. And as I said, there are no coincidences, because this happens at a time where the Syrian army, backed by Russia and Iran, was capable of retaking Aleppo from the Syrian rebels. And what happens at the same time is that there's a shift in Turkey's policies toward Russia and Iran. So the ceasefire and the evacuation of the civilian and rebel forces from Aleppo was actually designed by Russia and Turkey. So there's a shift here in the axis of the alliances of the war. At the same time, and it's, again, it's not a surprise, while the Syrian army was retaking Aleppo, all of a sudden 1,000 fighters of ISIS attacked the historical city of Palmyra, Tadmur, which is to the east of Homs in the desert, retook the city from the Russian and the Syrian troops. This is not, it's not only not a coincidence, but it's amazing how thousands of fighters of the Islamic State move through the deserts, attack Palmyra with heavy weapons, and none of the 40 so-called coalition countries, NATO and the US, with all their AWACS and radars and drones and all that, noticed that these fighters are moving and retaking the city. This is unbelievable, to say the least. So my sense is that when the United States, UK and France and their regional allies like the Gulf monarchies in extension, then they realized that the Syrian army now was almost retaking the biggest chunk of the Syrian territory, especially a city like Aleppo with almost 2 million people, like Mosul in Iraq. And the Russian, Turkey, Iran alliance is more successful in fighting ISIS in Syria. They try to open up a new conflict zone, try to arm all possible forces to sustain the conflict rather than try to solve it politically. Now, one thing is interesting in this scenario, that the President-elect Trump was saying that he's not interested in regime change. Rather, he would collaborate with Russia in fighting ISIS in Syria. If this is the case, and if he stick to this strategy, then that probably would be the first sign of ending the conflict in Syria.
Right. So if we were to try to understand both countries, if you turn to Iraq again, as I mentioned in the introduction, the government forces are trying to dislodge the Islamic State rebels in the city of Mosul, which is a very large city and comparable to Syria's city of Aleppo in some ways. How does this fight for Mosul compare with the one for Aleppo, keeping, of course, these comparisons and the changes are forthcoming, as you say, with the Trump government. We hope that there's a solution in Syria. But, sticking with what we were doing here, which is trying to draw comparisons and what we can learn from them in moving forward, give us a better understanding of that.
Right. Two things. The first one is, the Syrian army, backed by Russia and Iran and Hezbollah, were fighting in Aleppo, not so much ISIS, but actually rebel forces who are allies of the United States. Whereas in Mosul, the United States and other almost 40 countries with the Iraqi army are fighting mostly ISIS. So there's a big difference here between the two. That's why you can see the conflict in Aleppo, and with all its dimension, the humanitarian, etc., disaster was fully covered, whereas the conflict in Mosul is almost invisible, because there, the Iraqi army with the Shiite militia supported by Iran are fighting ISIS in Mosul, unlike in Aleppo. And the second thing is that the Iraqi army, the Syrian army was capable of retaking Aleppo because there was a serious attempt by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah to support the Syrian army and engage in the conflict to retake the city. Whereas in the case of Mosul, the U.S. is not serious in retaking the city of Mosul. They have 1,000 of so-called advisor and trainer and what have you, but de facto they are not interested in supporting the Iraqi army to retake the city of Mosul. And quite the opposite. What you can hear is that it's almost impossible to retake the city within the next few weeks or month, or probably years, because of the way ISIS is fighting in Mosul. But if the U.S. and the so-called 40 countries coalition were serious about fighting ISIL, they would have pursued different strategies and contain and then weaken and then defeat ISIS. But this is not the case. So you can see you have two different conflict zones with two different interests, two different agendas. In one case, it's more successful in Aleppo. And Mosul, I don't think we will witness, as I said a few months ago on the real news, the liberation of Mosul anytime soon. Quite the opposite. It will be a protracted war of attrition for a long time to come.
And the Iraqi government's alliances with Iran, what does that have to do with U.S.'s disinterest in assisting, I guess, a more expedient way, the overtake of Mosul and pushing back the ISIS?
Well, you see, in the meantime, Iraq is also an ally of Iran, and by extension, supporting the Syrian government in Syria. So the interest of Iran and Russia is primarily to defeat ISIS in Syria and in Iraq, to sustain the government of al-Assad in Syria and the Shia government in Iraq. Whereas the United States had two different agendas, one for Iraq and one for Syria. And again, I was saying in the real news a long time ago, when war becomes permanent, justification, alliances, and so on become contingent, right? Depends where you are fighting, you choose different allies, and you pursue different strategy. Whereas in the case of Iran, Russia, Hezbollah, the strategy is clear: to defeat the rebel forces and ISIS, to sustain the government of al-Assad in Syria and the Shia governments in Iraq.
Right. And Sabah, finally, when you turn to the New York Times and some of the main Western press, you see extensive coverage of what's happening in Aleppo, but very little coverage of Mosul, except for, say, Patrick Cockburn in The Independent in the UK, you know, who actually made this comparison between Mosul and Aleppo, and the lack of coverage there is on Mosul. What's your take on the coverage of Aleppo versus Mosul?
It's clear. I mean, the case of Aleppo demonstrates very clearly the weaker position of the United States and its allies in Syria. Because Syria is not a civil or sectarian war. Just like I was arguing long ago that the war in Iraq was not sectarian or civil. It's an imperialist war of terror, right? It's a proxy war taking place. So the position of the United States and their allies, the European allies and the Gulf monarchies and so on, is weakened. And now the relational forces are shifted to the advantage of Iran and Russia. A new dimension to that, new alliance emerged, especially after the coup in July in Turkey. Turkey shifted its position and became much more closer to Iran and Russia. And as I said, you can see that ceasefire and the evacuation was designed by Turkey and Russia. And last week or a few days ago, the three foreign ministers of Iran, Turkey, and Russia met without the United States, without the United Nations, to design a political solution for the conflict in Syria. This shows that the real shift of relational forces on the ground to the disadvantage of the United States. So the whole coverage of the media about the massacre and war crimes, the crimes against humanity by the Syrian government and Russia is so disingenuous. It wants to cover up the loss and the weakening of the United States in Russia by presenting it as a moral humanitarian issue. Whereas in the case of Mosul, as I said, the U.S. is not really serious about fighting ISIS. It's mostly Iran, the Iraqi army, and the Shiite militias, and Turkey to some extent, especially in Bashir, close to the Turkmen, the Afar region. So again, the whole hypocrisy of the Western media about war crime and crime against humanity against the Syrian government and Russia doesn't mean that they didn't commit crime. But it means that if you compare what the United States and NATO did in Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan, and by the way, the forgotten war in Yemen, a million of people were killed, displaced. This is a Holocaust of the 21st century. And all these Western media are actually not only quiet about it, but they try to reframe it in a way, as Trump supporter would say, there's a genocide against the Christian people. Putting the perpetrator victims on its head, just like the Nazis used to do in 1930, blaming the European Jews for all the disasters and miseries of the German Empire.
And Sabah, it's not just the press that is alleging the war crimes or the behavior of the Russian and Assad governments in Aleppo. It's also the UN has taken some action to look into this. What do you make of that?
Well, again, if you have such a complex scenario in which multiple actors are involved, it's not really clear who is committing what. But one thing is very clear. Everyone has blood on his hand. So no one can be innocent. No one can claim that he or she did not commit any crime. That's for sure. But the question is, why singling out one or two specific forces and leaving all others who are equally involved in these war crimes? This selective prosecution is one of these, as I said, hypocrisy of NATO and US or a war of terror since 2001. Just to give you an example, my argument is to say, for instance, President Obama in 2009, if he would have prosecuted Bush and Rumsfeld and Cheney for war crimes and crimes against humanity, if the UK prosecuted Blair for war crimes and so on, just like they did with Joseph J. Poe and Taylor, if they would have done this, we wouldn't have ISIS today. If the United States opted for political solution in Iraq to reconcile between all the segment of the Iraqi population, not opting for military strategy, not creating more militias, but investing in infrastructure, electricity, water, job for the Iraqi population, we wouldn't have ISIS today. If the United States would have supported different political forces in Iraq and not nominating and sustaining al-Maliki and his Dawah party who attack and massacre civil population in Iraq, we wouldn't have ISIS today, and so on. So all these lessons tell us that the United States is not interested in any political solution of the conflict in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, etc. Rather, as I argued before again and again, the strategy of the United States is a permanent war. And this is the only way the United States can ensure at least the slowdown of the fall of the U.S. empire.
Right. And I must add that Amnesty International just in October issued a report asking the U.S. government to take responsibility for its own destruction and crimes against humanity that it had conducted in Syria. But if you read the Western press, you don't see very many references to that particular report by Amnesty.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, they can kill, massacre, and commit genocide and so on with impunity. And then they are surprised that people, fight back or hit back in a violent way. I mean, yeah, Happy New Year.
Goodbye 2016. Looking forward to the Trump presidency ahead in terms of the challenges that are upon us. I thank you so much for joining us, Sabah Alnasseri, and I look forward to having you back in 2017.
Thanks for having me, Shamli.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.